All right, now hit the camera button. Hit the camera button to shut it off and then turn it on.
Okay, hold on. Didn't hit it yet.
Shut your camera off and then turn it on.
All right, hold on. Turn it on.
Perfect. There we go. So now we're ready. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. These are your two sharp needles, Gavin Rice and Jack Stanley. And in this episode, we are going to be talking about Eldridge R. Johnson and the beginnings of the Victor Talking Machine Company. And Jack Stanley mentioned that he would like to talk about somebody that not everybody knows made a huge contribution to the development of the Victor Talking Machine Company. So please, Jack, would you mention that individual?
Well, good to see you. And the thing is, we alluded to this fellow before. We talked about him 2 shows ago, and how he helped the Columbia Phonograph Company. This was a lawyer by the name of Phillip Mauro. And of course, we had Berliner. Okay, we had Berliner, who was making his records. He was doing great, and absolutely becoming a record to be dealt with. You know, this is the typical, Berliner gramophone without the reflection. There we go. But the thing is that Mauro wanted to basically find a way to kind of put the brakes on the Berliner company. And so he bought a gramophone and put a needle, put it on the record, turned the record, and the record moved with the needle in the groove of the record. And there was this old patent by Bell and Tainter that dealt with the cylinder machine with a needle and a screw, which basically moved a floating reproducer. And that was a very important patent that they used on the cylinder machine. But he took that loose interpretation, brought it to court, and actually forced an injunction against Berliner using that flimsy interpretation. And it worked. And Berliner was forced out of business. Now, this had severe ramifications. First off, you had Zonophone. And Zonophone, of course, was run by Frank Seaman. And so he had free run of doing lots of things. And he created his company. His machines were somewhat like the Berliner gramophone. There were some improvements, but also he felt fine just taking some of the records from Berliner and just wiping off the titles and just a clear area here, and you just had the record. And that was basically the beginning of the Zonophone. The Universal Talking Machine Company. In fact, this is a very hard to see, I guess, but this is a Universal.
Good on my end. It looks good on my end.
Okay, good. This is a Universal Talking Machine. This is like pretty much one of their rarest labels. It's 1899 to 1900. And so all of this is going on. Berliner is sitting there kind of digging his heels in. And also, got to remember, Berliner has a lot of stuff going on in Europe. But in the United States, the fellow who had been behind Berliner for several years was a fellow by the name of Eldridge Johnson. And Eldridge Johnson had made improvements on the gramophone, was manufacturing all the parts. He was basically the supply man for Berliner. And of course, the Berliner gramophone had become extremely popular through the actions of Frank Seaman. And by 1899, Seaman is just going to town selling stuff. And the thing is that Eldridge Johnson builds a factory, and 3 stories high, to manufacture gramophones and making the parts and experimenting. And then all of a sudden, out of the blue, everything stops. Now, he had just built the factory. He had just spent almost every cent he had in expanding everything. And suddenly, everything came to a grinding halt. He didn't know what the hell had happened. And so eventually he finds out. He discovers what's going on, what Columbia is doing, what Siemens doing, all of this chicanery going on, and the court cases going on against Berliner. And through all of this, Eldridge Johnson says, I don't have a choice here. I have to do something. And so he had been experimenting in starting around 1898 into 1899 with doing what he called wax recording, rather than the acid-etched discs that were done by Berliner, which were kind of harsh sounding. Johnson's work basically used, like a wax. Actually, they melted Edison cylinders, brown wax cylinders, to use for their masters. I mean, it was just basically taking the other stuff because they didn't have the mixture yet. And so he had been experimenting, and there was a fellow working with him. And we're going to talk about this other fellow shortly. But the thing is that Johnson eventually takes that process, does not apply for a patent, but comes out with his first records because he has to. And they're called the Consolidated Gramophone Record. And these are from Philadelphia. These are not Camden, and then of course it has information on the back. I don't know if that comes in very well, but basically what it says, these notes on the back sit there and tell you that you can't copy this. And also, if you take this record and it doesn't play well on the machine you have, it has nothing to do with the record because the record's perfect. Well, why not? Perfection has been reached. And so they advertise, they start to sell. It does not do very well initially. It's small potatoes. Frank Seaman and Columbia both come and attack Johnson to put him out of business. They take him to court, and a big battle ensues with Phillip Mauro. And they do their best. But Johnson prevails and is the victor of the court case. And the only thing Johnson loses on is he can't use the word gramophone. Because gramophone is considered the right of a Berliner thing. And Berliner was basically forbidden from business in the United States because of stepping on the Bell-Tainter patent. And so he goes into business, very, very small. At the same time, Columbia says, we have not a single patent covering anything. And they create the Climax record. Okay, these are Climax records. And they have no patents at all. And then Johnson gives Columbia a hard time because he says, I've got the patents which I have just received. I'm working with Berliner a little bit here and there, but I have all these patents of my own. Meanwhile, Columbia finds a fellow that had been working with Johnson, as I mentioned before, and his name is Joseph Jones. And he knew what Johnson was doing with his wax recording. And Johnson didn't patent it because his lawyer said, don't, because people will know about it. So Joseph Jones writes up a patent, submits it. It gets kicked out. He writes it again. It's kicked out. So who takes the patent, the application? Phillip Mauro. He takes it and rewrites it completely, puts it in, and it passes. all of a sudden, Columbia has the patent on wax recording. Eldridge Johnson is stuck because here's the issue. They look at Johnson and they're going, hey, you can't make records. We've got the patent on wax recording. But then Johnson says, guess what? I've got the patent on disc records. And so they sat there and start screaming, hollering at each other. And they finally realized they can't exist.
Right.
And once the Victor talking machine is formed, which is basically the powers of Berliner and Johnson together,
right,
they pool patents, and then they both go on their separate way. But it's all because of the actions of Phillip Mauro, who gets right into the fray, totally transforms the entire disc industry. Because Johnson wasn't planning on going into business. It was great being in the background, supplying Berliner. He had a great business going there.
right.
And so that's how Victor gets its start. It's really quite an amazing thing.
And it's funny that the name Victor comes from him winning the dispute, the court case, of course.
That's one of the ideas, because it seems to make sense.
Right. And because I can't think of anybody that contributed in the start of the Victor Talking Machine Company named Victor, or it could have been, the Victor of something else, but I think that makes the most sense. And, I also wanted to talk about the compound of the records in the late days of the gramophone company to the Victor Talking Machine Company. The records are made out of a hard rubber, if I'm not wrong. And yeah, of course. And if you can immediately feel the difference between shellac and hard rubber. And I'd like to talk about some interesting notes that was also changed after Berliner sold the gramophone company to the Victor Talking Machine Company, or sold the patents rather. I am fortunate to work with Timothy Charles Fabrizio. And of course, he has an original Berliner gramophone there with the original instruction pamphlet. It's a little square piece of paper. On the other side, it says, change needle after 2 plays.
Yes.
And it says, if you do not have a needle, use a nail. Now, imagine scraping a nail against hard rubber.
It probably would.
I wouldn't. And of course, that leads to a lot of the records being damaged beyond, a lot of them you can kind of mess with to get something out of it, but many examples have been shredded with people using nails to play them. So
Sure. Even
later,
the nails, the needles. Think of it this way: nobody really had any sense or understanding of the idea of the needle wearing out.
right?
That wasn't in their minds.
Right. And they were like, change it after 2 plays. That seems like a waste for a needle. But, luckily, the Victor Talking Machine Company changed the composite of their records and changed it to a shellac with a.
We must take a step backward, though, with that. That was Berliner who changed it.
Well, of course, right. Okay, that's true. Yeah. Berliner changed it, and then, the Eldridge R. Johnson improved upon it. You're right. I should have mentioned that.
That's true. I mean, the Doranoid company. We talked about Doranoid.
Exactly. Right.
They're the inventors.
Right.
Of that compound, which is, there should be a historic marker on that building. And there's nothing. It's right in Newark, New Jersey.
It's still there.
It's still there. There should be a marker on that building, because this is where the recording industry, for all intents and purposes, really gets its start.
Right.
And there's nothing.
And, the Doranoid company, they were the ones to improve on Berliner's design, and actually they decided to. Of course, the grooves are a bit. They're. I don't want to say wider. They're more detailed, and because of that, you need a softer, yet durable, which is why they're called the Duranoid company. And so, actually, within the grooves, I was talking to Wyatt about this. There's like a sand substance. It's not exactly sand, but
Yeah,
it's it
the great. Yeah.
it's like a grain, and it wears the needle out first
Hmm.
before the needle wears the record out, which in the hard rubber era did not happen. Because you just have
No, no.
right, you
The
just have a
interesting
needle
thing
scraping.
also is that they had different compounds. I mean, the basic recipe for the 78 record, it goes through changes. It's improved. That graininess initially had been things like horsehair
Right,
and a rope. You got a picture, it's 1898 or 1897, and there's a Duranoid, and they're sitting there looking at these hard rubber records and saying, what the hell do we put in here? Just
right,
throw in the kitchen sink, see what happens, And so,
right.
you know, because they were making chess pieces. That's what they were famous for.
Making chess pieces, really.
Chess pieces and buttons and things like that.
Huh.
That's what Duranoid was for. Just like the company, the Burt Company, which would create what were they called? The Globe Record Company that
Right,
made IMAX and Zonophone too. It's kind of
of course.
interesting little stuff. But they were also making buttons and chess pieces and stuff like that.
Huh.
Um, that's why they went to these companies, because they were making this semi-plastic material, which
Right.
was plastic. I shouldn't say that. This hard rubber kind of stuff.
Substitute. Right, right. Really interesting. And of course, the Eldridge R. Johnson, of him being now a owner of a company, he then started to hire people to decide what the music is that goes on the record. So, Jack, do you know any of the people that were first hired in the popular music or the classical music department there?
I'm trying to think of his name. Don't you love it when you have someone's name in your head and you can't think of it right off
I
the
know.
top of your head?
Yeah.
But what he did, um, I know the guy died in 1942. I don't know. I know what year he died, but I can't think of his name. But I will put it this way: that Johnson, right from the beginning, he realizes that he is in competition with Zonophone. He's in competition with the illegal Columbia Climax records. And so he wants to do something slightly different. And he wants to start focusing eventually on classical. And the whole idea behind the classical was he knew it isn't going to sell. It's not going to sell very well at all. But if you have a world-class artist who's recording for you, then you really must have the best ragtime. You must have the best jazz. You
Right.
must have the best symphony. All of that. It's basically he comes up with the first real great marketing
Right.
for the phonograph, or as he would call it, the Victor disc. And they came out with a whole array of Regal machines. All of the machines that they introduced, like the Victor 1, Victor 2, Victor 3, they weren't called the Victor 1. They were called the Victor the First.
Right.
Very
Victor the
much
First, Victor
like,
the Second.
you
Right.
know, it's Victor the Sixth.
Right.
They were very regal. It snob appeal. He really creates this whole idea of snob appeal, and then surrounds himself with a series of really smart individuals who understand marketing They understand the industry. And also, Johnson realizes that advertising
Right.
is a very important thing. And so there's advertising. There's all kinds of things going on that nobody else had done in that way. I mean, Berliner advertised, Edison advertised, but not in such a massive fashion.
Right.
And it totally changes the industry.
And all the other companies started to copy that.
Oh,
Even
yeah.
Edison. Even
Yeah.
Edison.
Well, the old
You know?
saying goes, imitation is the greatest form of flattery, right?
Right.
You know, basically, because he had the design that worked. And then he realized that he wanted to get involved with the gramophone and typewriter company.
Right.
And he sends one of his people over, and that gentleman that goes over, picks lots of music, and they set up a trade deal that they will trade the matrices, stampers from Victor for the matrices and stampers from G&T.
Oh, right.
And they set up a deal with the White Star Line, by the way, a ship
That's
called the
cool.
Oceanic,
Right.
the forerunner of the Olympic Titanic. There was
Right.
She was called Queen of the Seas, and she was one of the fastest ships. And it was also snob appeal. Once again, think
All
about this.
snob appeal. Right. Of
And
course.
all this, the fanciest ship on the Atlantic Ocean is used to ferry these stampers back and forth. And they go, and basically everything is done on the Oceanic until the Lusitania comes out.
Right.
And then the Lusitania is used
Right.
because it's faster and it's also prestigious.
Of course.
Yeah. You know, it's sort of like if you look at another company and they say, well, if it has to be there right away, we send it on, you know, at the
Right.
same kind of thing. It's basically saying fresh off the presses.
Right.
That quick it comes to you. So, I mean, it's an amazing creation of not only artistry, industry, but publicity, constant publicity. Millions of dollars are put into publicity in their money in those
Yep.
days.
Very good.
It's really
Right.
amazing.
It is.
And it changes the whole industry.
Absolutely. And now we're just passing the 22-minute mark. And one thing I'd like to mention
Sure.
is that the reason why our videos are only about 20 to 25 minutes long is that, Jack, I wanted to let you know, YouTube, when videos are under 30 minutes, they start to get recommended to the public,
Oh,
like
I see.
on the recommended page. So
Okay.
that's why I'd like to keep it at under 25. And also it gives us the chance to be monetized, which is later down the road. But now one thing I want to say is I had a request from a colleague to talk about, this is actually something really interesting, and I would like to talk about it too next episode, is how the Victor Talkie Machine Company and the Gramophone and Typewriter Company, or HMV, shared their masters and how that was agreed upon. We kind of talked about it a little bit here, but it would be nice to kind of expand upon it. And also
Sure.
the talk about the HMV and Electrola, you know.
Yeah, okay. I wrote a whole big article on that, so I can pull that out. I'll do some
Great.
research on that.
Very good. All right.
Come up with the name of the guy who was doing all this stuff, because he is so important
Right.
and it's amazing. I'm going to remember it as soon as we stop recording.
Good. Very good.
Nonetheless,
Well,
this has been fun. Thank you. It's always good working with you and doing this stuff and
thank you,
chatting.
Jack. I love to work with you too. Bye,
Okay,
everybody.
so bye-bye.
Bye-bye.